committed a crime. I hold it steady right there while I hit it. Well, I reckon that ought to get it working. Working, but it still got so terribly far to go. I committed crime, Lord, I need crime of being hungry and poor. I left the grocery store man breathing when he caught me robbing his store. I hold it steady right there while I hit it. Well, I reckon that ought to get it. Been working, working, but I still got so terribly far to go. See my sweet honey baby, gonna break this chain off the run. I'm gonna lay down somewhere shady. Lord, it sure is hot in the sun. Hold it steady right there while I hit it. Well, I reckon that ought to get it. Been working, working, but it still got so terribly far to go. Breaking rocks out here on the chain. Oh, I've been working and working, but I still got so terribly far to go. Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters above you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you'd better stop swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they're changing, changing. Whoa. So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I think this is about our 8th or 9th conversation in our Evelyn Barbour series. And we have one more conversation left in the series that will open in early December. But let me tell you a little bit about why we decided this particular conversation. Evelyn Barbour was someone who I was very close to, who helped me in the very early days of opening the Heritage Center. She passed away in 2014, and for many of us was a great loss. And at that time, we decided to name this series after her because of her great interest in history. She was really the keeper of our story, both for the Heritage Center and for the local African-American community. She was an alumnus of the Jefferson School, was amongst the first graduating class of Jackson P. Burley High School. She went to Virginia Union and for her undergrad, and then the University of Virginia School of Education.
She taught in various school systems and retired after more than 30 years of service. So I can think of no other person more fitting to have a series that really is about contemporary thought named after them than Miss Evelyn, as most of us called her so fondly. Tonight, though, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ashley Farmer and talking a little bit about her book from 2017, Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era. As a conversation, this conversation tonight feels to me to be one that really coalesces some of my thinking about trying to do a series of conversations about Black women and their contribution to policy, to community, even in moments when they did not have the kind of, for instance, voting power. And in the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I think that this is without question an important discussion to have. How did Black women move this country forward? So I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Farmer tonight to our conversation. Let me just give by a few words of introduction. Dr. Ashley Farmer is a historian of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics. She is currently an assistant professor in the departments of history and African and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her book, Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era, is the first comprehensive study of Black women's intellectual production and activism in the Black Power era. She is also the co-editor of New Perspectives on Black Intellectual Tradition, 2018, an anthology that examines 4 central themes within the Black intellectual tradition: Black internationalism, religion and spirituality, racial politics and struggle for social justice, and Black radicalism. Farmer's scholarship has appeared in numerous venues, including the Black Scholar and the Journal of African American History. Her research has also been featured in several popular outlets, including Vibe, NPR, and the Chronicle Review, as well as the Washington Post. Dr. Farmer earned her BA from Spelman College, an MA in History and PhD in African American Studies from Harvard University. She is also the co-editor and curator of the Black Power series with Ibram X. Kendi, published with NYU Press. Dr. Farmer lives in Austin, Texas, and tweets from Dr. Ashley Farmer, or at Dr. Ashley Farmer. And before we bring Dr. Farmer on, I just want to read one thing from the back of her book here. By Dr. Kendi. Remaking Black Power is an indispensable triumph. Painstakingly researched, artfully organized, crisply argued, utterly insightful, Ashley Farmer has remade Black Power scholarship like the Black women she chronicles. And I think in some ways we want to start there, because the idea of Black women involved in the Black Power movement, that is not a conversation that we hear in everyday parlance, as much as this can be considered to be everyday parlance, right? So let's talk about, first, tell me a little bit about why you felt it important to write this particular book under those circumstances.
Yeah, so I'm somebody that grew up learning a lot about activism and about the movement. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm the product of folks that were involved in the movement in Nashville and attended historically Black colleges and universities. So, I always grew up with this kind of understanding that women had an important role to play in the world that I see around me. And often that was downplayed in history books. But so I wanted to, kind of emphasize that Black women were engaged in a broad range of politics and political organizing, not just only the things that we hear in kind of the traditional civil rights movement. So that's kind of one part that led me to write this. The other thing is that, I grew up around really smart women, and women who I view and who many viewed as intellectuals even if those outside our community and the history books didn't frame us as such. So one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of combine that interest in talking about the variety and diversity of Black women's organizing with the idea that they could be considered thinkers and theorists and intellectuals in their own right. So the book really chronicles the Black Power era, as we call it. So from the 1950s and early 1960s, when things were getting going, all the way through, the 1980s. And it talks about all the different ways Black women engaged in politics and Black power, both the kind of ideas of it and its like everyday manifestations. But it also really talks about them as people who shaped the ideas about what Black power meant and how it should be practiced. And most importantly, how it was kind of both a theory or a philosophy and a form of politics that could help Black women get free. And so I really wanted to combine both of those ideas and kind of, I don't know what you would call them, I guess, or undercurrents of my life growing up when talking about Black power and the Black power movement.
Mm-hmm. Is there any one sort of stands out for you in terms of sort of exemplar of what you were attempting to achieve in the book?
Yeah, so one woman who I begin it in the book with, and actually am going to write my second book, a biography of her, is a woman named Queen Mother Audley Moore. And so many people may know her from reparations, or perhaps, her final kind of public appearance was at the Million Man March. But I really think in a lot of ways, she was the architect of what we would call kind of the modern Black power or Black nationalist movement. So this is a woman who was born in 1898. So, she lived almost a century. She died in 1997. But she really came into her own through Marcus Garvey's UNIA and Black nationalism. And then by the 1940s and 1950s, she was seen as, like I said, they call her Queen Mother, because she was kind of seen as both a movement figurehead, but also kind of an organizational ideologue or theorist that taught this next generation of Black activists how to organize through the Black Power movement. So she mentored everybody from, folks in the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party. It's said that she, at least talked to and kind of helped shape Malcolm X's thinking. And then also was somebody who took Black Power international, which I also talk about in the book, and was the guest of several heads of state in Africa, such as in Tanzania, in the 1960s and 70s as they were decolonizing. So I like to talk about her and kind of begin in the book with her, because I think she shows the continuities between like an older period in the early 20th century. Audley Moore had a third grade education, not a lot of formal schooling, but was seen as somebody that you needed to go to learn how to think about organizing, how to think about Black power, and how to effectively kind of catalyze and move people towards a goal. So even if she wasn't like an intellectual in the traditional sense, she really was a fountain of knowledge that not only kind of bridged older folks and newer folks, but really also bridged folks in the United States to Africa.
Mm-hmm. So with such prominent involvement, I mean, you, as you're describing her, you would have thought that she would have sort of been, you go from Sojourner Truth to Queen, right? How does she fall out of that narrative? How does that actually occur?
I think it's a good question. I think there's a couple of things. Like I said, she was a poor working class Black woman without a lot of education. And so we tend to not focus on those folks, in part because we still have kind of a top-down understanding of how we even study Black women's history, but also because sometimes the written records aren't there in the same way, right? She wasn't a copious writer, but she was a master orator and speaker. But sometimes we privilege that kind of written word and people writing speeches and treatises and books in a different way than we do, somebody that just pulls out their stepladder on the street corner and, corrals people to action. So I think that's part of it. I also think that there's this issue of not respecting Black women as the leaders of organizations at the grassroots level. So, she was never a leader of, what you would say kind of like a nationwide organization, but instead somebody that kind of sowed the seeds of Black power and Black nationalism in different spaces by working through grassroots and neighborhood organizations. Sometimes we don't have those records, but more often than not, we just kind of don't see that kind of work because it doesn't look like a formal organization with kind of like a great man at the top or the head of it.
Right. Or I'm thinking a little bit about, when you're talking about the power of the pen, and the capacity to, be maybe an Ida B. Wells who had a
Mm-hmm.
platform where she would be able
Right.
to articulate those things, and so elevated in that way. So,
Yes,
um,
exactly.
so let me just sort of pull this out a little bit
Mm-hmm.
broadly. So, um, in terms of how we then are beginning and how you frame the conversations about women, and also even when we're thinking about now about how we are re-articulating the discourse about women's suffrage and the
Mm-hmm.
sort of desire to reinsert Black voices into that, um, uh, into those spaces. And I think that when I'm thinking about your book, I think that is the power of that, these stories are being pulled out of these sort of places of darkness, for want of a better word, into the light.
Mm-hmm.
And so, can we a little bit about how then bringing these stories in then causes us to re-articulate what a Black Power movement would look like then, or how do we understand it then?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So there's a wonderful scholar named Peniel Joseph who also writes about the Black Power movement. And he always says that for a very long time, we framed Black Power as the civil rights movement's evil twin, right? So the story goes is that there was this, very peaceful civil rights movement with, Brown v. Board and Rosa Parks, and then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. And when all of a sudden that didn't quite, kind of create the bastion of liberalism and equality that everybody thought it would, Black people turned toward this kind of nihilistic, angry, violent form of Black power, right?
Mhm.
What I'm doing is talking about how we should rethink that narrative on a couple of fronts. First, by starting the book in the 1950s, I talk about Black women like, Audley Moore, who I talked about. Another woman I talk about is Mae Mallory. Kind of everyday Black women who were engaging in what we would call kind of proto-Black power or Black nationalist principles like self-determination, self-defense, community control. And I show how they were thinking about and organizing around these ideas, even as, right, at the same time that somebody like a Rosa Parks was doing the Montgomery bus boycott, or King was kind of rising in the ranks in the civil rights movement. So I kind of challenged that, Black power was just a reaction, and a negative reaction and a violent reaction to the civil rights
Mhm.
movement. Another thing that I'm really trying to bring forth is like a lot of people act like the civil rights movement was this very long and drawn out thing that made a lot of sense and had a lot of cohesion and goals, but they don't always see Black power that way. It seems kind of scatterbrained. Maybe you know about the Panthers, maybe you might know about Malcolm X, but that's it. So one of the things I'm trying to show people is how much of like an organizing tradition and how much of a set of ideas, again, broadly framed around community control, self-determination, and self-defense, there was, and how much buy-in by everyday Black people, particularly Black women, there was into these ideas, even
Mhm.
as there might have been competing ideas about integration. So that really shows us that it wasn't kind of a flash in the pan movement, but more so something that drew people in because it offered values and ideas and organizations that they felt made good, make them feel good about themselves, but also felt like they were viable paths to, more Black liberation. And then finally, I would say that one of the things I'm really trying to do in the book is just discuss everyday Black women. So I always talk about kind of the Black power big three, which is Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, and Elaine Brown. And these
Mhm.
are wonderful women. They're all still living. Many of them write, tons, right? And I would never
Mhm.
dream of trying to speak for their stories or them, when they were here to do that themselves. But kind of coalescing only around those kind of very well-known figures, it kind of makes it seem like there's only a few women or a handful of women that ever engaged in Black power. By talking about, kind of everyday Black women that we don't hear about or may not know about, I show how, interested Black women were in Black power ideals and how it wasn't so male dominated as many people try to make it seem
Mhm.
or may believe.
Mhm. So, is it possible then to assign you know, a particular uh, course of action to Black women that may or may not be different, that would be different from the kind of masculinity and machismo we associate with Black men within this movement? Because I'm asking that to sort of say, to also, how does the participation of Black women serve to dismantle a sort of white supremacist system then? Like where, yeah.
I think it's a great question. So I can think of a couple of ways in which, particularly in the book, I address this, right? So some of it is that, one of the debates you see is not just about Black women talking about, Black power as, community control, self-defense, and self-determination, but them talking about it in ways that I would call gender specific. So what does self-determination look like to a Black woman? What does community control look like to a Black woman? What does, all of these different kind of principles look like? And one of the things that we find when we look at how Black women express them is that sometimes they were a way to confront the system head on. So a perfect example of this would be something like the ways in which Black women infused ideas about the welfare state into, infused ideas about Black power into the welfare state, saying that, the right for self-determination and community control means that they don't want surveillance over how they spend the money and who they get to have in the home, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes Black women tried to use art or culture to challenge white supremacy. So, either creating actual images, creating satire like literature, right? Creating photographs, cartoons, etc., that expanded what Black women could be, how we depict Black women, in an effort to combat kind of the demonizing and very stereotypical tropes and images and caricatures of Black women that white supremacy puts out. So I think that it really helps us understand all the dimensions and the ways in which people took on the ideas of Black power, and also shows you all the different ways Black women kind of deployed Black power ideas to help push towards the dismantling of white supremacy culturally, politically, sometimes just on their neighborhood block, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that brings me to sort of a question about when this, for you, your broader sort of interest in Black intellectualism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there is a way in which now you're beginning to describe a sort of feminine intellectualism, a way of which, women then bring their own sense of moving around in their cultural space to this larger conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were going to characterize the implications of that for, say, Black women freedom even, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that operating, for instance, in sort of like a political realm of the time? You want to think about right away, you want to think about someone like, ran for vice president, just ran in my head.
You're talking about Shirley Chisholm back in the day?
Thank you.
Okay,
yeah,
I
am. I'm sorry. It just ran right out of my head. I was like,
that's all right. It's been a long day.
As a figure like Shirley Chisholm, stepping out and into that political field. How do you characterize that?
So one of the things I think that you see across the board with the women that I discuss is they're saying, we want to take these ideas about, critiquing capitalism, for example, right? Or critiquing white supremacy, or critiquing, and then adding in also a critique of patriarchy, right? Saying that, we're down with changing the system. We're down with uprooting and thinking about Black empowerment, but you've got to mean all Black people, right? Including Black women. And if you're going to fight against things like white supremacy and capitalism, or be anti-poverty, right? Or, anti-big business or anti-colonial, you also have got to think about the ways in which that affects Black women specifically. How do Black women sit at the intersection of, being usually the most poor in a community, while also experiencing the white supremacy, while also experiencing the patriarchy, right? And from that, you see these spaces where Black women are allowed to kind of bloom and grow. Your comment about Shirley Chisholm, I think, is a great one. There's somebody who is saying, I'm not just a women's president, or when she talks about her candidacy, even though I am a woman, right? I'm not just the Black candidate, even though I am a Black person, and I'm very proud of that, right? But what she's offering is a form of kind of Black empowerment and self-determination and community control that is based on the idea that she's not going to separate those two things, but that bringing those together can be, a form of liberation for all people if we follow behind her. Just to give you another example, thinking about somebody like the Black Panther Party, they had many women, it kind of started out as more of a male-dominated organization, even though women were in it from, a very early kind of the origins of the organization, but it still had a very masculine ethos and bravado. And one of the things that I kind of trace out through the book is how Black women pushed back against that and said, if you really want to be the revolutionaries that you say you are, right? If you really want to be the leaders of this movement, then you have got to talk about the ways in which Black women are affected by all the kind of critiques you have of America and racism and poverty. And you've got to be the kind of people that don't reassert those kinds of power dynamics by being sexist or patriarchal in our organization, right? So I think by that kind of that intellectual standpoint that comes from being a Black woman, not only were they able to kind of diversify the expressions of Black power, but they also pushed those men and sometimes other women in the movement to kind of further to the left in their understanding of what liberation means, right? And what kind of organizing they should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting point. And if you were going to sort of think about this, and this might be, it's not one of the, I'm thinking about sort of Pan-Africanism, because during that Black Power movement as well, this is a almost, you could view it as kind of a global space. Absolutely. Right? And you can view it as we do see the resurgence or the insurgence over even sort of African tradition in the conversations, in the language. Can you talk a little bit about that and the sort of ways that this Pan-African space works within this overall sort of intellectual dialogue?
Yes, absolutely. So, it's kind of functioning in two ways. So there is a segment of the movement, often called cultural nationalist, and they were the primary drivers of this kind of Afrocentric idea or return to Africa, right? And here I'm talking about Malana Karenga's US organization, and to some extent, folks like Amiri Baraka, who functioned and worked in Newark, New Jersey. And the idea behind it was this, right? In order for Black people to be able to assert political control together, they've got to rid their minds of kind of the white supremacist cultural aspects. So the kind of a cultural revolution predating a political revolution. And so they created new ideas about what it meant to be an African American that were linked back with an idea of an African past or connections to Africa rather than America. Probably the most prominent example that most people know about for this is Kwanzaa, right? It's an effort to say, the Christmas tradition as we do it, as we celebrate it now, is rooted in white supremacist ideas, both culturally and also in terms of the ways in which Christianity has demonized or been weaponized against Black people in the past, particularly in slavery. So why don't we create this new tradition around, African-centered values? So that's kind of one way to think about how Pan-Africanism worked. They also, changed their names, changed their dress, changed their hair, all in an effort to kind of reconnect and identify with the global kind of African community. But I also want to emphasize that in this particular moment, Black power seems really possible because of the rapid decolonization of Africa, right? In the 1960s and 1970s, there's a record number of African countries that are gaining their freedom from European colonial powers, sometimes through bloody fights and sometimes through just, kind of a European withdrawal and a transition. But either way, if you're a Black person in America, you're really seeing what you feel to be Black power in action, right? Black people running a Black nation state, of other Black people. And so it's a really exciting time. And it's a time when you feel like you want to go there and reconnect with this kind of understanding of Black power and also learn from it. So it's also a moment by the 1970s where we have record numbers of activists. Many of the women I discussed in the book, from, like I said, Queen Mother Moore, May Mallory, Panthers, et cetera, who go to Africa as visitors sometimes to kind of meet and learn from people there, but also sometimes they relocate as expats, right? As a way to kind of rebuild, the nation states such as Ghana, Tanzania, that they feel are a good investment in this. And that whole idea functions around the idea that, or their efforts to go back and forth function on the idea that they are part of a kind of global African community, and that their fate here in the United States is intimately linked to the liberation and fate of those in the African continent. Now, I want to point out that, this also sometimes created ideas of kind of an undifferentiated Africa, right? Or an essentialist idea of Africa. Right. And we all know that, it's a very variegated continent with different countries, traditions, peoples, political ideas, formations, et cetera, right? So sometimes these activists kind of over glorified or, kind of hyped up the idea of Africa as kind of this unified thing, and were very disappointed, right, when they got there and learned that it was not kind of the mythical space and the utopian space that they kind of imagined it to be. But nonetheless, it was a moment when people really just got to even think about what they thought it was, and what it actually was, and what it could be in a different way, because of this moment of decolonization and this rise in kind of Pan-African sentiment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm also thinking even about, the kinds of, the 1965 Immigration Act that really sort of allows people to begin to start to move. And likewise in the Caribbean, you're having that same kind of decolonization that's happening. And so it's really sort of this interesting fervent that's happening, grounded in this conversation or reiteration of a conversation about Blackness and what that all means. Yeah.
And I'll also add a couple things. I mean, so you also see folks who would, students, from kind of elite class in African countries come and learn here, right, at American universities, and then go back and lead as, kind of state leaders. So you get a different kind of interaction with those folks that they might have met before they were heads of state, right, and now became that as well. So I think that's a really interesting kind of moment and idea. And also just, the desegregation and lowering in rates of transportation plays a huge role in this. The ability for someone to scrape enough money or fundraise even to go to Tanzania, to go to Ghana, right, to go to Algeria, is, an invention of this moment and somewhat the product of civil rights organizing. But that really allows people to forge these connections that were much more limiting before.
Right. So thinking about a trajectory, right? And not kind of taking a step back for a minute, but I want to also sort of set this up as not necessarily a timeline, but maybe a pace-line, right? That when we started talking about the civil rights movement, the early actions of the civil rights movement, we move into the Black Power movement. We've gotten into the 1970s. How do you, and I'm trying to get us now to today. And if we're thinking about Black women and Black women's sort of intellectualism around how engage in creating a space for Black femininity, even, how do you trace that trajectory? What are the trends that you can point to that, are either these high moments or even these low moments that we as women sitting in the room today are sort of looking back on, or thinking that we're creating something new but haven't really done that?
Yeah. So I end the book talking about the Third World Women's Alliance, which is, a kind of a Black feminist turned, women of color feminist group. So they started as a Black women's collective. They noticed that they share some of the same kind of oppressions, although not exactly the same, with Latinx women, with Asian women, with other folks. And they tried to form kind of a broad-based collective. And they are in part of where we get this idea of kind of women of color feminisms, women of color organizing as collective, a coalition building. But also, there are also some of the folks where we can trace ideas about intersectionality, which have now become, a huge buzzword. They were very much invested in an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-sexist critique, right? So bringing all those things together. So I think that they left a very lasting legacy. And again, I position them as people that come outside of the Black Power movement, or through the Black Power movement, rather, as laying the groundwork for some of the ways in which grassroots organizations today talk about how we should be attacking, racism and sexism, or racism, sexism, and poverty, right, all together. So I think there's a huge intellectual tradition that comes out of Black Power that ask us to understand how we move at or work at different intersections. Also, I think that there's a huge kind of legacy of Black Power about self-determination very much at the community level. One of the things that you see throughout the book is the ways in which Black women, whether it be through the Panther Party, whether it be through creating co-ops in schools, right, whether it be through creating mutual aid, work together to meet the needs of their community and also try to help determine, kind of the future of the community or control over their community. And I think we see that very much today, particularly in this COVID moment where, we see the state is not offering people benefits or ideas. I think it's important to think about the ways in which Black women throughout the movement have created these kind of safety nets and mutual aid. And then finally, just representation, like you're talking about with Shirley Chisholm, for example. I mean, we certainly see Black women activists moving from, the activist realm into the kind of what we would call formal political realm. And kind of the biggest or best comparison I might make is in the 1970s, the Black Panther Party ran folks like Elaine Brown for their local offices, like mayor and city council. You see somebody today like a Cori Bush, right, who was somebody who was organizing in St. Louis and now has won a seat in Congress. So it's a way in which we see Black women coming through grassroots organizations and movements to places to kind of occupy what we would constitute as, formal political spaces or spaces with a bigger platform.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about, you were talking about, you mentioned mutual aid, you mentioned grassroots. And I think that is an interesting space to even try and describe, right? Because I think about even as we're thinking about women who, mostly middle-class women, received the opportunity to vote in 1920 or 1923 when they were really able to do that. It was women of the middle class. How do you describe the sort of class structure within women's organizing and really sort of thinking about this as a grassroots place? But how do we think about that? Are those hierarchies consistent in the descriptions that you are thinking about in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly most of the women that I am speaking about in the book would not be considered middle class women. They are women who usually were facing some sort of issue and either joined the organization because they felt like the organization was addressing their issue, or created the organization themselves because nobody else was addressing it, right? So I think about, for example, some of the women that might have joined the Black Panther Party, right? Typically, these were women who maybe had some level of college education, but really were folks that had grown up in the area, right? And had recognized that some of the issues that they were talking about, whether that be the lack of, nutritious food, lack of health care, et cetera, were started to create these kind of survival programs to be able to do so. If I talk about, say the cultural nationalism that we spoke about, earlier in our discussion, both in Los Angeles and in Newark, New Jersey, these are mostly women from the community that were creating independent schools to help combat the cultural education issues that they were facing, co-ops and restaurants where they were pooling their resources together in order to make clothes, provide food for themselves and the community. Or I even think about a woman like Mae Mallory, who I talk about as kind of a Black nationalist through and through, who got into the movement because her children were being treated badly at school, but she worked in a factory. She was very much a working class Black woman. Now, that being said, organizing does take time, right? And it does allow you to be able to not be at work, or it requires you to not be at work, right? Or to not be a caregiver in order to do that. And so I don't want to give the impression that everybody that I talk about in the book didn't have some level of, nobody had any level of kind of privilege or influence. But one of the things that we see keep bubbling up in the course of this kind of organizing groups is ways in which they tried to help women be more politically engaged, right? So sometimes that meant creating childcare centers so that they could take turns with childcare so that they could go into the community and organize, right? Sometimes that meant having childcare somewhere else so that people could attend a protest, right? Or doing things at a space that was outside because it was a confluence of where everybody got off work and was near the train, right? So you see ways in which those who have some privilege are trying to kind of bridge that gap, and also ways that people tried to basically fit organizing into the nuances and cracks of everyday life, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the story too that I think feels like it falls into the cracks, because like, going back again to how we think about, we think about the Black Power movement as such a sort of intellectual, that all the men were college educated, that they all, were reading the right Marxist text, and creating their discourses out of these spaces. And even when you're looking at images of the co-op schools, they are very male focused as well, right? You're seeing those images that have this very sort of masculine male figure, as I would think partly as a kind of propaganda in some ways.
Absolutely.
And so, to think about the very long history even of how women have engaged in this community aid. It really has been about how do we get to the very basic need before we can move on to this next level, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's organizing from one's lived experience, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to take a minute just to give people an opportunity to formulate questions if they'd like to engage in some questions. But let's think about moving forward. What do you believe are the lessons that today's female activists should learn from the women that you talk about in the book? What are those tried and true road marks that you think will help today's movement, whether it be Black Lives Matter movement, whether it be, a description of a trans movement, or however that sort of falls out?
Yeah, I think it would be two things. First is that, people did study, it's funny that you mentioned kind of this male-centered understanding of the intellectual and that they were reading everything, but the women were reading too, and they were very good, right, at parsing through what this meant and figuring out how to apply that theory to their lives, right? And it didn't always look like school, for example, take the Panthers again. They had political education. You had to read certain things, right? And you were able to not only be literate about them, but also engage your other Panthers and folks in your community about them. The goal was to give frameworks or tools for understanding what was going on around the world. Because when you had those tools, you were able to come up with solutions that made sense, right? That was the point of studying, right? To get a theory or a worldview and then get the tools to help kind of figure out how to change that worldview and change that in others. So, I just want to put an employ for the importance of reading. These women were not folks that just got up one day and just decided, they were going to be activists, but they were also studied intellectuals and took the ideas and the activism both very seriously. The second thing I would say is that, I think a lot of why the Black Power movement is not studied as much is because it feels like we can't mark clear, quote unquote, successes from it, if that makes sense. Unlike, say, the Montgomery bus boycott or the Civil Rights Bill or the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, right? Or the Suffrage Act, et cetera. But I think, and one of the reasons I study this so much is that I think there is real power in just thinking about what people's dreams and imaginings for what else the world could be. And I think that Black women, being some of the most oppressed, often come up with some of the most inventive and imaginative ways of being in community with one another, and also rethinking how we organize community. So, for those folks who are still trying to figure out how we move forward or what else we can do. I think this specifically, we talk about this idea of kind of defund the police, right? A big roadblock to that is just kind of imagining what we would do there instead. And I think looking to history, looking to people's dreams that even if they never were fully realized, offers a really great way to keep being inspired, to keep dreaming, but also to, just kind of get a wide kind of array of options of how people combated some of these things in the hopes of maybe figuring out what things might work now and how they might be adapted for the future,
How many of the women that I know we talked about this a little bit, but when you think about what is described as sort of the break power movement, how many of women that you talk about are still working in that vein?
Oh, most of them. If they're around, they are. Many of them are. Some of them have gone into kind of university settings or been in university settings and have been key teachers, not only of giving the history of the movement, but also kind of organizing through student spaces. Somebody like a Frances Beale, who I talk about in the last chapter, who started the Third World Women's Alliance, is still very active in Oakland, California. And you might see her at a rally, you might see her at a community meeting. Someone like a Kathleen Cleaver still speaks widely about the party, but also works at Emory, right? Engaging and teaching people about the movement. So typically it doesn't go away. And most importantly, a lot of them are advisors, right, to a next generation of folks. I always said people want kind of the playbook for the revolution all the time, and obviously things are historically specific, right? Not everything that worked in the 60s and 70s is going to work now. But a lot of these activists are great kind of resources for just talking through what they were thinking, what they tried, or even what they think about today, and what kinds of ways that their ideas might be adapted. But typically, if you went all in on this, it never fully leaves you because you remain committed to the idea of the world that you always envisioned, even if the organization you originally started with didn't go that way.
There was one question that I hadn't asked, and how do you describe the role of religion in the Black Power movement? I have studied this a little bit, but I don't feel like there's a lot of commentary about the role of religion and spirituality outside of talking about, becoming Afrocentric and creating that sort of Afro derived sort of lifestyle. But in terms of sort of American traditional religion, how does that play itself out?
I think it's complicated, right? Many of the folks that I see kind of get involved in these more leftist or radical groups were at least had some experience, if we're not completely raised in kind of the ideas of the Black church, right? And found some of what that was to be very confining. That being said, I don't think that any of them didn't believe or have some sort of kind of spiritual compass, but it didn't always follow that kind of traditional Black church kind of form of organizing. So you could talk about, James Cone and liberation theology, which, is kind of asking us to reinvent or rethink what Black, liberation looks like through Christianity. But there were also other ways in which they engaged in it. Like the Black Panther Party thought about the idea of having, a church, right? It wasn't a strictly kind of, Black Christian church, but it was one with the idea that Black people have found value in spirituality, found value in kind of collective religious practices, and felt that they should create a space that they could perhaps imbue some of those kind of traditional values about morality and rightness with their more radical views. Also being said, there's religion as an ideology, right? And there's also kind of the Black church as a social, cultural, organizational institution as well. And I think very quickly, many of these activists, whether they wanted to or not, realized that they needed the Black church, if that makes sense, right? So even if they weren't necessarily down with whatever that particular pastor was preaching on Sunday, they certainly understood it to be a cornerstone institution in the Black community, and one that if they viewed it less as a foe and more as a friend, they could reach more Black people and, kind of have a larger base of community support. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've got a question from the audience. So you mentioned Amiri Baraka, we know artists were integral in the movement of the 60s and the 70s. What do you think their specific contributions were? How did female artists contributions play out?
I think it's a great question, right? So one of the kind of main things that many scholars kind of fight back and forth about is whether the Black arts movement, which is often kind of called the sister or the corollary to the Black Power movement, was the real movement, or was the Black arts movement really the real movement and the Black Power movement was the political wing of that, if that makes sense. But what really they're getting at is the defining and imperative and indispensable role of art and culture in any political movement, but particularly in the Black Power movement, right? So you see Black women engaging this through all forms. You might find, poetry of Sonia Sanchez, right, or Nikki Giovanni that is really trying to overturn the idea of a white form, right, in terms of genre, but also talking about what is covered, right, the Black experience and centering the Black experience like that. But you also saw a lot of visual art. One of the main things I discuss in my chapter on the Black Panther Party in the book is the ways in which Black women artists within the party use the Panther iconography, so the leather jackets, the berets, use the Black Panther newspaper, which circulated worldwide to kind of reshape how people thought about Black women. So there I show their actual drawings drawn about Black women artists drawing Black women, right? And talk about how they're defying the stereotypes about what is typically depicted of Black women, but also kind of showing everyday Black women that they can be empowered political actors through art, right? And so there's this whole visual wing, there's this whole kind of artistic wing in the sense of, plays and literature and poetry. And so it's really a no-brainer in terms of that the Black Power's message would not have been so well received without art and without the centrality of Black women in art. So much so, right, that some people argue that the most lasting kind of a legacy of Black Power really is the artistic and cultural spark, right? So everything from this idea of Kwanzaa, right, as a cultural tradition, to the art of the Black Panther Party that we all know, to the poetry of the Black arts movement, right? That is perhaps the thing that has lasted and endured and changed how we think about Black people and Blackness, maybe as much, if not more, than some of the political activism.
Right. What do you think about, like you say, Nikki Giovanni's early, her poetry to Rap Brown and Sonia Sanchez and things like that. And even the sort of cadences of the lines, the ways in which those beats sort of, you move through the language in a very sort of lyrical kind of way that has that relationship. I'm going to, Leslie, do we have another question?
We do not.
Okay. Well, Dr. Farmer, we don't have another question. We've reached our time. So I'd like to thank you so very much for joining us. This, for me, was an amazing conversation. These were the kinds of things that if I weren't hosting, I would be sitting here, what about this and what about this,
Yeah.
I don't often have the opportunity to really sort of dig deep into this particular area. And it is an area that really needs to be mined, this idea of what even what the Black intellectual moment looks like and how do we take that forward into the movements that we are looking at today? What are the antecedents for the conversation? So again, thank you so very much for joining us. We greatly appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah. We have, as I said, one more conversation in this series. I'd like to also encourage you all to come down to the Heritage Center and look at the exhibition Salt by Lola Flatt. It's an exhibition that looks at women who are 70 years of age and older. It really wants to speak to the idea of the ways in which we engage in youth culture and privileged youth culture. Instead of valuing our older folk and the knowledge that they bring. So again, thank you all for spending some time with us. We greatly appreciate it. We know that you could be doing other things. So have a really good night. Thank you.
Thank you.